Imagine this, an alternative to plastic inspired by nature.
It took me a good number of years to detach my sense of self-worth from that of the business.
The scientist who spent a decade turning her discovery into a startup.
I just don't think in short timeframes.
A lot of us do, though.
I know, but I don't.
Kia ora. Welcome to Imagine This, a podcast about all the wonderful creative people here in Wellington who are doing awesome things in business. My guest today is Veronica Harwood Stevenson, the founder of Humblebee. Hey, Veronica.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. So let's start right at the beginning. Tell me about where this journey began for you.
It began at university when I was studying reproductive biology, and we were learning about things that cause disruption to normal fertility and regulation. And I learned about a class of hazardous chemicals that were used and are still being used, and the literature that I was reading around those was such that I knew eventually governments would step in and change regulation, ban these, because they were just so conclusively damaging. Causing testicular and kidney cancers, thyroid and hormone dysfunction, reductions in fertility for both men and women. And that has happened and opened up a market for these alternatives.
Did you see an opportunity there to try and find an alternative to these chemicals that were so embedded in our daily lives?
I did, yeah. And I wanted to find something that was non-toxic and was looking at biology background, and so I started to look in the literature for something that existed in nature, and eventually came across this solitary bee.
So tell me about this bee.
So many people think that honeybees and bumblebees are the only bees, but solitary bees are actually the most abundant bees in the world, and this particular species that we identified creates a plastic to line its nest, and that plastic has some of the performance attributes of some of the hazardous chemicals I mentioned earlier. And so we decided to try and reverse engineer that nest material from the bee that the bee makes and figure out a way to make it at scale.
What was the next step that you took? Did you have to track down one of these bees, or how did it work?
Oh man, so hard. I just cold called every person I could find online who was in any way linked to bees and solitary bees in Australia and New Zealand, and found this guy who lives in Queensland called Chris, and he just his curiosity was piqued, and his family was very involved in mining, and he'd gone like, this is messed up, and he was working in native pollination services, so he had a business in native pollinators, and he's just like, that's cool, let's give it a go. And he set up some nests, and he just was like, look, these are very, very fussy creatures. There's no guarantee that they will decide to live in these nests that we've provided for them rather than out in the wild. But we did get some nest material, and we ran some analysis on it. That was me burning my entire life savings to run those first experiments, but saw that it had some really, really promising properties.
So this is over in Australia?
We got the nest material. So he set up the nest at the beginning of summer and spring, and then at the end of summer he checked them, and yes, there was some nest material, and then he had to send them to New Zealand. And very much a lesson of don't put all your bees in one box or one parcel, because they went missing.
Oh no.
And this was, a year, and we would have had to wait a whole nother year, right? Because the bee season was over and done with. And Chris was like, and they had a Ministry for Primary Industries permit on them. They were like fluoro parcel. And so I, again, was on the phone, ringing every, postal station in the North Island. Have you seen? And as soon as you said that they were bees' nests, people were like, So we did end up tracking them down.
And so you ran these tests, and what did you discover?
That it self-extinguished when it was exposed to naked flame, which was really cool. It was hydrophobic and was resistant to very, very strong acids, very strong bases and solvents, which was a replication of some of in the literature that we had seen from other species who were closely related.
You mentioned that you had used a lot of your savings to do this early stage research. How confident were you that you were going to get those results, or did it feel like a punt to be spending so much time and money?
It was a bonkers punt.
Yeah.
I remember my family being like, "What? What are you doing?" Like, this was you had been. I'd been saving for a house since I was 10. So it was an odd decision.
So you did face opposition from people around you who said, "This seems like a weird idea."
They thought it's like people didn't understand it. And I think at the time, people didn't really see plastic pollution as a major threat.
How long ago was this?
10 years ago. And they didn't know that synthetic biology and biomanufacturing, so using genes to produce products, was going to be a thing in consumer goods. Like, it had been a thing in pharmaceutical industry for a long time. I mean, that's how hydrocortisone and things that we use every day are made. And so they were like, this seems very far-fetched and kind of sci-fi. And even, I pitched to some investors 5 years ago, and then I had a conversation with one of them the other day, and he's like, I didn't get it, and now I'm seeing this kind of thing everywhere. Like, you were just ahead and early. So people have come to understand it.
So what did you do once you got these results back?
I tried to find investment and couldn't. And my original research partners, had said, look, we'll do some work in kind, and we'll take kind of 2 to 5%. And then they did the work, and then they sent me a contract that said that they owned 52% of the company. And so quite a long battle ensued, and I just got really burnt out. And after having spent kind of 2 years doing that, rather than progressing the business, and I did a master's, and then I tried to do a real job for a year, and then I started to see that that then was more appropriate for trying to raise capital, because people were starting to see that plastic pollution was so bad, and that synthetic biology was starting to be seen as a more commercially viable route for manufacturing. And I was like, all right, and it was just niggling. It was still that curiosity and that, like, what if? And I reckon it can be done. And so I decided to move to Wellington.
So do you come to Wellington with the intention of knocking on doors of science and tech and research agencies?
Yeah.
And how did that go?
Actually, the most promising, it was odd because someone kept looking at my LinkedIn profile. You know how you get notifications of like, so-and-so has looked at your LinkedIn profile. And I was like, who is this person that keeps looking at my LinkedIn profile? And so I ended up messaging him and saying, let's just meet up, because I looked at his profile and I was like, you seem super interesting and you clearly think I'm interesting, so let's meet up. And so we had this conversation, and he said, you should meet Richard Furneaux, who is a professor out at the Ferrier Institute, which is associated with the University of Wellington. And we met for a drink, and I showed him the research that I'd previously commissioned, and he's like, this is fascinating, we need to figure out. And he has such an incredible reputation, and once we had him on board, we were able to cost the next step. So I had a research plan, but he was able to cost it and put it in a form that came from a really reputable source. And then once we had that, then I was able to start ringing around investors and getting a lot more traction that way.
So this came from you being interested and a bit sus about someone who'd looked you up on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And following that up.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah, and he actually, his name, he won't mind me saying this, is Kevin Sheehy. He works at the McDermott Institute, and he's wonderful. He's such a catalyzer of science and technology and development in Wellington. Yeah.
So it was about finding the right people who could actually take this forward with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what happened next?
We had to go and find more bees. So I went to Australia, and we had to get a certain number of exactly the same species, and then we had to keep them alive in order to get them to a lab to dissect them, so that we could run analyses on them. So we were kind of pulling apart. We knew where we thought we knew where the components for the material were. So we looked at kind of the internal anatomy of the bee from on academic literature, and we're like, look, if we pull that bit out and that bit out and we analyse the contents, we're going to understand what are the precursors for this material, and we can start making a chemical substitute. So we went, and there had been a drought, and it was sort of Christmas, and I was planning on going in kind of January, late January, early February, and Chris called me and he's like, there are very few bees around. Like, if you don't get here now, like, we're not going to be able to do this. And so I flew over early and spent a couple of weeks bee hunting with Chris. And because of the drought, the flowers that would normally have bloomed weren't blooming. And so there was this, we were kind of terrified that the population in the region was going to die off. And he started ringing around his mates who had big gardens, and they were like, oh, she can come and check my garden out. And so we just went to these people's houses who had, because Queensland is just so beautiful and abundant. But then you've got this problem of like, okay, I have this enormous bush that is flowering, and it has 20,000 species of insect on it, and you have to find your species, and then you have to catch it. So you have to. So I now can spot the silhouette of a native bee from like 5 meters away.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you had to go around actually catching the bees?
Because you can't find their nest because they're solitary.
Wow.
So you've got to catch them in flight while they're foraging. And they only forage early in the morning and early at night because it's the right temperature.
So how long did you do this for?
Weeks.
And you got enough?
We got enough. We only lost one bee. And so I became very adept at like looking at a bee in a test tube and being like, are you a happy bee or are you a sad bee? And do you need to be taken for a walk? And spent hours just talking to these bees and trying to keep them alive. Please don't die. And then we put them in a box, in a polystyrene box with some cool kind of freezer bags to get to the University of Queensland so that I could meet my dissectionist from who's an entomologist from the University of Wellington here called Phil Lester. He flew over to meet me, and we had like hired a lab, or we'd been lent a lab by the University of Queensland, and had this box of bees. And so I put the box on the train, and then I turned around to grab my suitcase, and then my pillow got caught in the wheels, and the doors were closing, and I was like, my bees! And so I had to just like dive, and the door had shut on me because I was trying, because I just knew that they'd throw the box of bees out.
Yeah.
Or it would be like this big hazardous thing, or like someone had left a box unattended on a train, like just, so saved the bees, got to the university, met Phil, he did the dissection, we took them back to New Zealand in liquid nitrogen, and then we had them analysed here at the Ferrier Institute in Wellington.
What have the last few years been like? Where are you currently at with this research?
A whirlwind. There have been a few more bee hunts that have also had sort of equally dramatic scenarios play out. But since then, we realised that the way that we were attempting to manufacture it using like looking inside the bees and wanting to create a chemical route wasn't going to work. So we sequenced the genome of the bee, and we found the gene that codes for the nest material, and we've taken that gene and we've put it inside some fast-growing bacteria, and that is replicating and makes the raw product.
So you can basically, in a lab, make the same material that the bee uses to make its nest.
Yeah.
So what would this ideally allow you to do? Is this about creating a natural alternative to plastic?
A natural alternative to different types of plastic.
Not all plastic.
Not all plastic. And as I said to you before, like plastic is a collective noun. There are thousands of different types of plastic, and if I said I had invented a new type of metal, you wouldn't be like, oh, cool, let's replace all gold and steel with the same thing, because you understand that they have different properties, and it's the same with plastic. So this is a very high performance polymer that has the properties I mentioned earlier about kind of heat resistance and solvent resistance and water resistance. You wouldn't make a plastic bag out of them. It would be a waste of those high performance properties, and it would be a very expensive plastic bag.
So what are some of the products that may be able to be replaced by this kind of plastic?
A lot in the textile space, personal care, wound care, bioadhesives,
Okay, so that's quite a wide range.
Yeah.
So how far along this journey are you? I think everybody wants to know, how close are you to actually making the thing that you can sell?
Yes, good question. So when people ask me this question, what I always tell people about is one of my favourite measurements is the TRL, or the Technology Readiness Level, which was a process that was developed by NASA during the space race. And it's kind of a scale of 1 to 9, 1 being it's an idea, 9 being it's a fully fledged product ready to go and be put into a rocket launcher. And we are at a 4 heading towards a 5.
Okay, so you're approaching the sort of middle of that journey. And so how many more years might be in the pipeline before you reach an 8 or a 9?
A few, like 3 to 5.
3 to 5. Okay, so science-based development requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of money. Is that one of the reasons why so few people go down the route that you have?
I think there are loads of reasons why people don't want to go down the route that I have.
Because we desperately need innovation in this country. We need people like you who are doing this long-term work to find these solutions.
It is hard when you have to keep in your mind's eye this thing that is intangible. And it's much easier when you have a widget that you can hold in your hand and see its progress. But that is just that's an imagination limitation. You know, I can see it. I can see it in my mind's eye, and that's enough for me to continue. And I can also see, in the same way that I could at university, the winds of change. I can see the winds of change coming for the many other thousands of chemicals, not just the ones that I first identified when I was at university, that I use on massive scales that are hazardous to human health. So I can see that there's room for a company whose product profile, not just one product, but many, many products that replace those hazardous, other hazardous chemicals.
You created this company by yourself. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, would you have liked to bring other people on board at an earlier stage?
Yeah, definitely. I wish I'd had a co-founder, because there were definitely times where I tapped out for a while, and having someone to kind of pick up the baton would have been really, really helpful.
What was the impact on you of having to try and keep this thing alive for so long?
It took me a good number of years to detach my sense of self-worth from that of the business. And so people go, a startup's a roller coaster. And I think that's one of the reasons people don't start as well. Like, it just is a recipe for depression often if you are not able to decouple those things.
Because you are relying on the product, or this imagined future product, to kind of justify all of this time and energy that you're putting into it?
Yeah, that, and then also if you are so strongly identifying your self-worth as an entrepreneur, then your mood and your sense of self-worth will go up and down with the progress of the business. So sometimes the business is going really well and you're having breakthroughs, and sometimes it's really not. And, there was a time where we had run out of money. I was writing a bid and I was capital raising, and I'd broken up with my partner of 6.5 years, and I was living on my friends' couches, and I was using my savings to float the company. And I just thought, like, what am I doing? Like, this is the worst. And if you're coupling your sense of self-worth to how well the company is going, then that's a bad place to be.
Yeah.
So I think having had someone else to kind of tag team and share the load would have been really nice.
And it's also so different what you're doing compared to a startup experience that is 6 months or 12 months or 18 months before you're able to bring something to market. I mean, you've had to have so much belief in what you're doing, and having not just a 12-month vision, but a 5-year vision or a 10-year vision. Where has that optimism or resilience come from for you?
I just don't think in short timeframes.
A lot of us do, though.
I know, but I don't. And I think about the ways in which we could live or design that take into I love Zealandia, for example, they put a stake in the ground and went that this is a 500-year plan. I'm like, great, more people need to think like that. The idea that, and it's the kind of the cult of individual, I think, where we're like, I have to be able to see and reap the benefits of this. And quickly.
Yeah.
And I don't think like that. I'm like, I would happily buy a bit of degraded land and plant a native forest knowing that I am never going to see that mature, because that is just not how I think.
What is the implication of that from a business perspective? Or what is the opportunity there for aspiring entrepreneurs who want to adopt that mindset?
To be able to solve really, really wicked big problems that are not really quick fixes. They're not building an app. And those are the problems that really need addressing.
Those are the important ones.
The really complicated ones with many, many factors that play into not just technical, but also, political, and people need to want to get really entwined with the problem that they're trying to solve.
What are the biggest obstacles to us doing that in New Zealand? What are some of the obstacles that you faced?
I do know of a lot of really smart people. I mean, in New Zealand and in Wellington, we have the technical expertise coming out of universities, and that is a real bottleneck of you go to university to do science, and really that's the only place that you can go and do that. And then if you're a student and you have an incredible idea and you work on it and you want to spin it out of a university, the way that they've structured the terms associated with that mean that there's not really a lot of incentive for that student to do the hard, long yards associated with a deep tech business, because at the very beginning, they have already lost 60% of the company. And if you're going to have to raise $100, $200 million and spend a decade of your life, why would you do that if you already only have 30% and you've only just started? And I think that's really short-sighted. And it's, are we creating a legacy, or are we in a land grab for IP? And I would love to see institutions in New Zealand, not just in Wellington, change their attitude towards encouraging and spinning out entrepreneurial assets.
And what is your advice to a young person, for example, who's at the point in their journey that you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Negotiate your position hard. Like, if you're... one of the things that was a super, and people, obviously not everyone has this, my father was a criminal barrister and had me very late in life, had no idea how to talk to children, and so just spoke to me like I was an adult and would ask me to kind of argue his cases. And so I just had a familiarity with the law, and I remember spending time at his chambers on Fleet Street in London and going and watching him in court. And so for me, a contract was, you always negotiated it. But you're a 19-year-old who's come up with this cool idea and you think it can change the world, and you are so hungry to change the world that you think that this institution is giving you good terms and knows what they're doing. And they're not bad people, but they have some bad incentives behind them. And so and then like 5 years down the track, you're going, my company's not even investable. Like we've done so much work, and you have to recapitalize it, and it's this absolute fight. So negotiate.
That's the key thing.
Yeah.
And what do the next few years look like for you?
One of the best things that has happened to the company actually was when I got pregnant, and suddenly something we've been talking about doing for a while was getting all the stuff out of my head and into systems we had to do, and we hired people, and now the team and the business is far more mature. We're just wrapping up a round of funding at the moment, which is going to be more than we've ever raised before. We're going to just be able to go really fast and get us to a point where we're able to start engaging with customers and giving them small amounts of product that they can play with and start putting it into their products.
So what are some of the skills that you've had to develop over recent years to take the business into this next phase?
That's a great question, and it was one that when halfway through my parental leave, I was going, all right, if I'm coming back to the company, as the chief executive officer rather than the chief everything officer.
Yeah, so you're now leading people.
Yeah. And a blessing and a curse, very high expectations of people. And so I hire great people and then I let them get on with it and I expect them to do well. And they do, because people love having autonomy. And if they have commitment to the cause and what you were trying to achieve and they feel trusted in their skills, then people do a great job. So I think you lead, that's one way to lead, and it's not particularly active, but it is has certainly worked well.
What's your big dream?
My big dream?
Now?
To build a company that that can replace every hazardous chemical that is used in consumer and industrial products.
That is a big, big dream.
Yeah. The company's so big it has to be broken up.
And you believe that we will see progress in the coming years or decades to eliminate plastic from our lives?
Look, plastic is indispensable. There are some things that you need plastic for. If you go to hospital, you don't want a plastic-free hospital, but you do want a plastic-free supermarket or close to. You know, there's a time and place for plastic, and I think we just need to get a hell of a lot smarter about how we produce, manufacture, distribute, package. But what I do want to see is people waking up to the fact that the consumer products and goods that they are being sold do come with health risks, and that we as consumers need to demand that large corporates do not poison us for profit, because there are better ways, they just haven't been looked into. But that is the tip of the iceberg. And I think that consumers will and should wake up to that. There's enormous opportunity.
And you're doing a great job not only of educating consumers, but also working hard to provide an alternative. So Veronica, thanks so much for sharing your inspiring story with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Imagine This is brought to you by Wellington NZ. Check out more episodes right here or wherever good podcasts are found. See you next time.